What happens when you swap out all-purpose flour for whole grain in your favorite sourdough recipe? That's what I've been wondering about for a while now, and I decided to test it bit by bit to see how much whole grain I could sneak in without changing anything else about the process or messing up my dough. So let's see how far whole grain can go. I think by now we all know that whole grain is better for you than all-purpose. It contains more nutrition, but I have also heard that it is a lot harder to make a nice loaf of sourdough with it. This video is part of a series where I test and experiment with all sorts of sourdough concepts, and you will find the playlist linked up there if you want to check out the other videos as well. So this was a fairly easy experiment to do. What I did is I took my standard recipe where I use 360 grams of flour. The other ingredients, you can find the list down below. And out of those 360, I started with using only all-purpose flour, and then I was gradually increasing the amount of whole grain, swapping part of the all-purpose for the whole grain flour. So it was always 360 grams of flour in total, just different ratios of all-purpose and whole grain. And I have gotten some pretty interesting results, so let's take a look. So the first bread that I've made, I've used only all-purpose flour. So just the full 360 grams of white all-purpose flour. Now, I never do this in my standard recipe. I always have a mix of a little bit of whole grain and a little bit of the all-purpose flour, and you will see why in just a little bit. So I mixed that up, mixed in all of the other ingredients. Again, you can find the measurements down below. I would cover the mixed dough with a plastic wrap, let it sit on my counter for about 2 hours, and then I would shape it into a Benetton basket and put it in the fridge overnight. This is my standard recipe. This is how I make bread all the time. And I have done this in the very beginning when I started making bread, that is using only all-purpose flour, because that usually gives you the best chance of a nice puffed up loaf. That's what I've been told at the baking class that I took, and it's usually the advice that you see online, and I find that to be true, that the all-purpose just rises the best and gives you the best looking bread. So the dough was sitting in the fridge for about 24 hours. The next day, I baked it at 250 degrees in the oven, preheated with the Dutch oven inside for 20 minutes, and then 5 minutes without the lid at a slightly lower temperature. And this was the result. Not that amazing, pretty bland flavor. Right. The problem of using only all-purpose white flour is that it doesn't give you much of a taste. At least compared to when you use whole grain, in my personal experience. Again, taste is a very personal thing. You might love the all-purpose flour bread, but for me, it's just, there's not much going on there taste-wise. So for my next bread, I did my standard bread. So out of the 360 grams of flour in total, I use 300 grams of all-purpose white flour, and I swap the other 60 grams for the whole grain. And this turns into the standard bread that I am used to, that I know I like the taste of. Even just those 60 grams, it really does make a difference in the taste of the bread, I find. And so, of course, I was happy with those results. Next up, I doubled the amount of whole grain flour. So I have used 120 grams of the whole grain flour, so doubling what I would normally use, and then 240 grams of the all-purpose. So we still have 2/3 of the dough are all-purpose flour, 1/3 is whole grain. And I was surprised. I thought I would see a bigger difference in the result compared with when I only used half of the amount of the whole grain, but it pretty much felt like the same bread. And so I was really happy with that result. And again, I haven't changed anything else about the recipe. All of the other ingredients are staying exactly the same. The timing stays the same. I don't do stretch and folds on any of these breads. I bake them at the same temperature with the same process. So it's really just the flour ratios that are changing. And I guess it is fair to say that the consistency and the state of my starter is changing as well, because the starter I am kind of feeding here and there. It's never really, I've never used like a peak starter for any of these breads. It was always discard starter from the fridge, but some of it was maybe a week old, some of it was maybe only 4 days old or 2 days old. So it is true that that has changed a little bit throughout all of these tests. Okay, for the fourth bread, I have again bumped up the whole grain by 60 grams. So now we are 180 all-purpose, 180 whole grain, half and half. And this is where I've actually started seeing a difference. And I'm sorry I didn't film me mixing the bread, but you will be able to see this in the footage of the last bread. It was the same thing happening. I could see that the whole grain was really soaking up more of the water, which is something that I was expecting because I've read about that online as well, that the whole grain soaks up more of the water. So when I was mixing the dough, it was a little bit less shaggy than the other ones. It was, before I added the starter at least, it really soaked up the water and it was just a more stiff dough as well. But in terms of the result, it wasn't really all that different again. And I was quite surprised because my expectation going into this was that I would start seeing the bread deflate as I add more whole grain. Because again, this is what I have heard happens when you add more whole grain, that there just isn't all that much of the rise. But it seems like when you go half and half on the flours, it still doesn't have much of an effect. What it did have an effect on was the taste. This was the first bread, so the fourth one, where I was like, yeah, I can really taste the whole grain flour in it, and it just wasn't my favorite. But since the rise was good, I was like, you know what? I will just keep going. And so I did one more test where I've again added 60 more grams of the whole grain. So I was doing 240 grams of whole grain flour and only 120 of the all-purpose. So we switched it, 2/3 whole grain, 1/3 all-purpose. And again, this was the result. Pretty good in terms of the rise. It looked the same other than like the color, like you can tell when you open the bread and you look at the inside or even the crust that there is more whole grain in it. But the difference was again in the taste. Not a huge fan. It's good, but not the best. So that was the last experiment I did since I could really tell a difference in the taste and I did not like the taste of this bread. I just didn't see any point in going any further. What I feel like is maybe happening that I'm not just used to the taste of whole grain. And maybe what I want to do going forward is definitely increase the amount of whole grain, at least to the 120 grams, where I still had really good results and I couldn't really tell much of a difference in the taste of the bread. Do that for a while and then see if I again swap another 60 grams, maybe I'll just be more used to eating the whole grain, and therefore again I won't see that much of a difference with the 180 grams with the increased amount of whole grain in it. That's the plan. We will see how it goes, but I'm so glad that I did this experiment so that I found out that I can actually use a lot more whole grain, specifically twice as much than what I was using before, and it doesn't have any implications on the process of me making the bread. It's still as easy as it was up until now. And so I would highly encourage you to do the same if you want to increase the percentage of whole grain flour in your bread. Just swap out a part of it. It never has to be all or nothing. You don't have to do a whole grain bread. You can just use a little bit of whole grain and you are still adding more nutrition to your bread. And if you do swap it out, definitely let me know what are the ratios that you are using and how it's working out for you. And that will be it for me for this video. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.